Rimma Boshernitsan, the founder and CEO of Dialogue. Welcome to 10 by 20, a series of 10 questions discussed in 20-minute dialogues with local and international leaders doing visionary work at the intersection of people, technology, and society. Hi, and welcome to our next 10 by 20. Today's guest is Indre Viskontas, a neuroscientist, opera stage director, and science communicator. She's an associate professor of psychology at the University of San Francisco, where she runs the Creative Brain Lab and the creative director of the Pasadena Opera. And she's also the new host of the Audible original podcast, Radiant Minds, The World of Oliver Sacks. Welcome, Indre.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so excited to chat. I feel like we haven't talked in a while, and this is a great way of, catching up on the past, a year and a half or something like that.
Agreed. Yeah.
So tell me, as we always do, we start off our conversations with how one grew up and how, that influenced your work. So I'd love to kind of hear more about that.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Canada. I was a child of Lithuanian immigrants. And so my entire childhood was based around trying to keep the Lithuanian culture and language alive, because at the time it was occupied by the Soviet Union. And so, I didn't speak English until I was 7. My parents only spoke Lithuanian at home, and we were very much tied to the community. So everything I did, folk dancing, Saturday school, scouting, protesting at City Hall and, Ottawa, was really about keeping Lithuanians, keeping the culture alive. And so that actually instilled in me a really strong work ethic, and also a sense of how lucky I was not to have to deal with the kinds of things that my family in Lithuania were dealing with and struggling with. So I like to say that the influence it had on me is in multiple ways. One, I always felt like an outsider, because not only was I not born in Lithuania, but I didn't fit in amongst my Canadian brethren. And yet I also had this really strong sense of civic duty that we had to do something all the time. So now I find it very anxiety inducing when I'm not doing something, when I don't have 5 million projects going, when I'm not sort of giving my all. It's very hard for me to relax.
I can relate to that too. I mean, I was 8 years old when we immigrated to the States from Ukraine, and I'm similar in that sense. And I feel like even though in our company we always have a few projects running at the same time, I still decide on let's spur up another thing, another initiative, another opportunity to do something that I'm like, why do I just not sit still for just a moment? But I feel like it's this thing I totally relate. I don't know if it's an immigrant thing or child of immigrants thing, but there is this need to be creating all the time, something interesting, something new, something valuable and impactful.
That's right.
Perform.
And always also having a kind of practical side to it. So, I have, my heart is in opera. I always wanted to be, an opera singer. That was my passion. And yet I always knew that I had to have a good backup. And that's where I got my PhD. That's where the science came in, science and math. I mean, those were things that, seemed much more stable and solid. And so, that I think allowed me then actually later on to spend a lot more time as an opera singer and now as a director, because I have, this foundation of, other things I feel like I can take more risks now. But interestingly, I feel like earlier in my life, it really was very difficult to take a risk on, say, your education, because you needed to make sure that, you were able to put food on the table.
Oh, totally. Hence my economics and art history majors.
Yes, exactly.
Totally. Is there one person that you would say that influenced you most and throughout your, maybe whether it's the neuroscience piece of you or the opera piece of you?
Yeah, there are a number of people. I just finished this podcast, as you mentioned, on the world of Oliver Sacks, and he was definitely a major influence, both in terms of my artistic, interestingly enough, and my scientific approaches. So his whole thing really was about seeing the gain or what is retained in the face of loss, and seeing the whole person and going deeply into a personal history or a case history to really get a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. And I take that approach approach now in terms of when I direct opera, when I sing opera, when I think about the art, is sort of like, what are these extra layers of meaning that we can extract from this experience? But it also influences my approach to science. And I'm a big proponent of neurodiversity, of the fact that we all have different brains. And for too long, we've lived in a society that is only built for a certain type of brain, and that leaves a lot of people out. And so that's a big focus of my work too, is finding ways in which we can accommodate different brains. And of course, the science communication side. I mean, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is ensuring that whatever we do learn in the lab gets translated to the general public. And, no one was better at that than Oliver Sacks. In fact, he was punished in some ways in his own career because he was too good at it. So I would say, it sounds very cliche, but I have to say that in so many ways in my life, Oliver was a huge influence.
Totally. Well, it sounds, and it's and such a through line across all the things that you're interested in and are doing with your career.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
Yeah. So is there one question that you say you answer through all of the things that you're working on, between the podcast to the neuroscience to the teaching to the opera and the creative aspects of your life? Is there one question that's overarching that you'd say you're
I would say that the question that I've answered and I've really worked hard to answer is this idea that talent is something that is just describes what it is that we don't understand yet that work can get you to. So let me unpack that a little bit and basically say that a lot of times we think of, people who are gifted or who are blessed or who have talent bestowed upon them as not being active participants in, developing that talent. And one of the things that I've sort of seen that I, from my PhD, where I, was looking at how memory is formed in the brain and that it's a constructive act, that it's something we actually do actively in the moment. We are not passive vessels. We actually actively construct memory, to my work at the Conservatory of Music in San Francisco, where I help musicians develop effective practice strategies, to really underscore this idea that it's what you do in the practice room, not just the hours you put in, but what you put in the hours. And now in terms of my work, in terms of understanding creativity, and I like to focus on the creative process and the different steps involved. So I would say that that's been a kind of, another through line in my work, is that, we really have to be mindful about how it is that we develop skills, whether they be creative thinking or musical performance or, even language learning, because skill development is something that very much, benefits from different types of training. And it's not just something that you're born with.
Totally. Well, and it's interesting because I think in our work, we think a lot about that in the context of like, what is it that you want to be and how do you manifest and put that in place?
Yeah.
And now, like, kind of over time, thinking about the future of those moments for yourself too. And like, how do you get from point A to point B, not, to your point, like not just by like checking all the boxes, but actually intentionally thinking about like, where am I most, where can I optimize myself the most, where I'm like naturally already flowing to, and how do I get myself still back to that North Star, but maybe it's not the traditional path and it's not sort of the diligence as like our parents might define, in terms of getting from point A to point B. But I love what you said about, it's the hours in those. How did you say it?
It's what you put in the hours, not the hours you put in.
Hours, and it's absolutely true. You mean you could check all the boxes and still not get to where you need to be, but if you intentionally sort of and purposefully align yourself to the mission that you're on, then you will get there.
Exactly.
And actually appreciate the journey, which I think most of our lives is really about the journey, not the destination anyway.
Yeah. And executive coaching is a great example of like, I think in the past people just thought, well, you're either a good leader or you're not. You either have leadership skills or you don't. And now we know actually you can improve those leadership skills, pretty specifically and pretty mindfully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So speaking of creativity, when would you then say that you do your most creative work outside of like all of the professions and the interests and things? I'm super curious, like what does that look like for you?
So it depends whether the creative work is idea generation, where I'm sort of, trying to figure out what the next idea is or solve a problem,
Mhm,
or whether it's in terms of like actually creating a product. So in
mhm,
idea generation and in that kind of phase or in that problem solving phase, I do my best work when I'm running. So I do
mhm,
the same run. Well, before I dislocated my shoulder and had surgery, and I'm in recovery now, and I can't do that run yet, but I will again. I used to do the
mhm,
same run 3 times a week, always exactly the same route.
mhm,
And on that route, I, would essentially have a problem that I'm working on,
mhm.
and I would solve that problem. It's like what some of my most creative time is, that or like on a hike or et cetera. So it has to be walking, it has to be in nature, and I have to be alone. But then when it comes to the actual product, I'm much better bouncing off people. So I
Mhm,
thrive in conversations with other individuals, and often like even when they're painful. So in
mhm.
rehearsal or when I'm working with an editor, I feel like I do my best work when I'm frustrated, when we're trying to, we're like trying all these different things, and I'm being pushed by the people around me.
Mhm.
They're not letting me off the hook. I think sometimes it's really easy when you're alone to be like, well, I don't have that good idea right now, so now I'm going to go and have a cup of coffee or take a nap or whatever. But
Yeah,
in rehearsal, like you've got 3 more hours with these people or with your editor, they're not going to let you go if you haven't, like,
yeah,
no, that idea still isn't right. And I
yeah.
feel like that's sort of when I'm able to produce the final part of the creative product is under those circumstances.
Totally. Well, I totally echo the walking and the movement to generate. For me, it's the same thing. And bouncing ideas off of people. I'm like a verbal thinker. So I have
Mm,
to process verbally. I don't internalize anything. If I actually, in fact, like if I internalize, um, it's probably a bad thing because it means that I'm not fully actually getting to my all the things out that I need
yeah.
to get out. So I really appreciate that. It's so interesting. Um, and I love that too. Like, how often do you come across, like, in your, let's say, like with the students that you're teaching, how often do you come across people that are, um, like their internal processors versus verbal processors, and like, do you find that you have to change your approach and how you kind of even teach in a way so that they process things differently?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes in the classroom, I have students who are very shy and who won't speak up,
Mhm,
and so I have a lot of techniques that I use to
mhm,
entice them to just say anything, and create an environment in which speaking your mind is safe, so it doesn't feel
mhm,
like you have to come up with a polished, finished idea. And the same thing in rehearsal. My approach to rehearsal is block but shape. So I give wide strokes at the beginning, but then we spend a lot of our time reshaping and reshaping and reshaping and trying different avenues. And I won't say to the person, well, I need you to raise your left arm to your right eyebrow and the gesture that looks like it's like I won't be that specific, but I
mhm.
will ask them to do it 10 times until they come up with the specific movement, and then help them remember what it was that they did so that it comes organically from them.
Mhm.
And oftentimes what I find is that their solution to the problem is more natural, better, looks better than one that I would have imposed upon them. Because we all have different bodies, our bodies move in different ways, and I can
Mhm.
have one image of how I think a body should move, but that might not be in line with that person's motor system. And so if they can, come at it themselves, then it's much more likely that they will feel comfortable and confident and remember that
Yeah.
particular staging. Which, I think a lot of directors, a lot of the issues happen like, yeah, sure, opening night sounds great, but performance 10 looks totally different because their actors now have started to do things that come more naturally to them and not just what the director had told them.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so interesting to think about that because so much of it, and I'm not in the theater space, but I imagine that a director might be imposing their own will, in a way
Mhm.
on and what they're seeing as like the vision of the entirety versus like actually creating space for people to be who they are and then building around that. And I think so much of that actually translates into any workplace,
Mhm.
right? Like if we
Yep.
just did that for people, then maybe the whole DEI thing, would have been happening a long, long, long time ago and wouldn't even need to be called out because we would naturally be already kind of including people and appreciating for who they truly are.
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. I think that's exactly on point. And I think that that's something that we underappreciate, the fact that, like, sure, I have a way in which I can do something and I can ask you to do it my way, but that doesn't mean that ultimately that's going to be the best way. And the only way I'm going to know that is by giving you the space and, whether it's psychological or physical, to do that thing.
Mhm.
And, so in your own way. And I totally agree.
Hmm. So interesting. How would you say, like, so, I mean, there's so many things that you're doing right now and always, it sounds like, right?
Yep.
Um, is there one particular thing that you're most excited about right now that you're also seeing that there's major shifts happening as a result of the work that you're doing with whatever that you're focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned at the top, there's this focus on neurodiversity in my work. I see this
Mhm,
really big shift in how we think about differences, and
mhm.
I think that some of the work that I do is highlighting the way that a person's neurology or nervous system might appear to us or to someone else, and how biased we can be in terms of assuming that someone else's experience matches ours,
Mhm.
and yet how wrong that is. So,
Yeah.
for example, one example I have is that Ed Catmull, who was the founder of Pixar, the famous animation studio, he was,
Mhm.
instrumental in creating the first, completely digitally animated movie, Toy Story. He has no visual imagination. So he does not see images in his mind's eye, which is shocking
Wow.
when you think about the fact that he is basically, responsible for some of the most imaginative animated films we've ever known. And
Yeah.
he didn't even realize that that was different and that that was the case until much later in his career. It's called aphantasia, an inability to visually imagine. And so there are all kinds of
Mhm.
ways in which our mental lives are totally distinct and different. And so I think that it's really kind of important to sort of not impose your own mental cognitive structure onto someone else. And if we don't do that, think about how much more we will be able to solve the major problems that help us, because we will have so much more diversity of ideas, right?
Mhm.
So that's kind of, I feel like a lot of the work that I do is really in highlighting how, yes, there are a lot of things about our experiences that are universal and that we can relate to each other, but there are also a lot of ways in which we experience the world very differently, and
Mhm.
that is meaningful and important, and also really great ultimately for the
Yeah.
future of our planet.
Totally. And so important to harness like these unique points of view that otherwise might be completely obstructed by like the commonality of everybody. But right now, I wanted to transition us into a rapid fire.
Okay,
So, yeah, are you ready for some quick questions?
sure. Hit me up.
All right. So, when do you feel most connected to others? And when and where are you happiest?
When I'm with my kids, ironically,
Yeah.
or when I'm on my run and having that great aha moment.
Hmm. I feel you. Is there a location, like a geographical location that you all want to be at or like to be at?
Yeah, Golden Gate Park is our happy place. We spend a lot of time exploring that park and all the different places in it, and that's where I do my run. I run through the park every time.
Amazing. I love that. What intersection of disciplines are you currently most fascinated by?
Neuroscience and music.
Hmm. Cool. I feel like there's more coming, but no. Okay, neuroscience and music, which is in and of itself very.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm also interested in media and how it affects our minds, like digital technology and sort of how it affects our ability to imagine, and sort of just how our minds work. It's another area
Mhm.
that I think is really interesting.
What's your greatest regret?
Not having had my kids earlier. I put it off because of my career, and I feel like that was a mistake. If I had to do it over again, I would have had them earlier.
Well, you would have had different kids earlier.
I would have had different kids earlier for sure. But yeah, I become very nostalgic, and I feel sad that there will be a lot of their lives that I will miss out on. So I got to live long and keep healthy.
You will. You will. What's the one thing you wish to pass down to the next generation?
I wish to pass down a real respect for others, and this sense that just because someone isn't like you doesn't make them lesser than, and that also there is work that we have to do in order to find that connection and respect each other. Because ultimately, if we don't have mutual respect, society is going to crumble. But if you have mutual respect, almost everything else falls away.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important. And the mutual, like, being the operative word.
Mutual,
And so
right. Just
absolutely. Yeah.
go both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited, and I look forward to seeing you in person very soon, I hope.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks, Rimma. We'll
Good
have
to
to
have
catch
you.
coffee soon.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Indre. Thanks for tuning in to Dialogue's 10 by 20 interview series, where we ask 10 questions in 20 minutes to profile international leaders working at the intersection of people, technology, and society. That's all for today's episode. Like and subscribe below to get notified for our upcoming interviews. Follow us on Instagram at dialogue_co.